this Future of Data podcast, we'll talk to John Gibs about his journey through digital industries, and we'll share some of the best practices. So stay tuned. Welcome to another episode of Future of Data podcast. Today we have with us John Gibs. He's a Chief Data Officer and Chief Data Scientist at L2, a digital research, benchmarking and advisory services company recently acquired by Gartner Group. Prior to his time at L2, John founded and was a Group Vice President of Data Science and Analytics at Huge, a digital marketing agency in Brooklyn, and spent 10 years at Nielsen running its digital and analytics practice. So John, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Beautiful. So I think when I looked you up on LinkedIn and looking at your profile, I think it's fabulous. So very decorative on the digital analytics space, and I think you guys have been, at least the digital industry has been one of the first primary adopter of data analytics, using data for decision making and all that fun stuff. Like you guys leading that chart for quite some time. So before we get into some of the meat of that, love to know your journey. What brought you to this industry? What you do, why you do, and what are some of the motivating things, and what are some of the golden nuggets you picked along the way as you grow into your career into this beautiful role?
Sure. So I guess we'll give you sort of the long walk, and we'll see how that goes. So when I got out of graduate school, I did most of my graduate work in spatial statistics, and this was just at the beginning of when the internet was starting to become an important factor in communications, media, commerce, etc. So the late 90s. I came out of graduate school hoping to get a great social science job, hoping to work for a nonprofit, and I was going to go change the world. We changed the world in a slightly different way, perhaps in digital, and not maybe in the way that I had thought initially. But got out of graduate school, was looking for a good guy job like that, and at the time, a good friend of mine was at a company called Jupiter Research, which was a early research firm really focusing on sort of new internet developments. I came on there to run to work in their data group, and then eventually run their data group. Left there at a certain point, went to Nielsen for a while, which has had its sort of interesting own up and downs with digital over the years. Spent a little bit of time in the agency world, and then I'm now here at L2. I think that the one major nugget that I've learned along the way that I would share would be that if you think about my background, geospatial statistics and then survey research, you think about two different things that aren't necessarily what we think of as either large-scale data or data mining type practices, or you think of them as relatively small data type issues. And what I've found is that many of the skills and many of sort of the conceptual frameworks that are used in those fields are extremely useful to be used as we're thinking about the world right now. So a good example is one of the products that we run here at L2 is a search intelligence product. It allows us to extract a great deal of content from Google and help to report and analyze the success of different types of brands on Google. So we ran into an issue in terms of a capacity issue. How many keywords could we extract in a given time? So we have a lot of different folks sort of trying to think through this problem, and we came to a solution by using actual relatively straightforward sampling theory that you develop when you do sample frame development in general survey research. So we're kind of using very sort of older methods and more sort of traditional methods to apply to current problems in a way that are extremely effective. And we found that many of those sort of old tools can't really be thrown out. And maybe it's just me talking as an old guy, but I do appreciate some of the old tools. And when you read, for example, in a lot of the literature, well, we don't need probability anymore, or we don't need statistics anymore because we have such a high volume of data. That seems like a clearly short-sighted approach to me, based on sort of the way that we have to think about, even on a normal level, managing data sets or analyzing different types of data sets or doing different types of predictive modeling, even on a temporary basis.
Interesting, and thank you so much for shedding a light on that. So let's talk about L2. Like, what is L2 for our audience, and what do you guys do, and if you can shed some light on that.
Sure. So L2 is a digital benchmarking company. What we do is we look across about 30 different verticals, and those verticals can range in size from the hair care industry to restaurants to automotive to different types of beauty categories to consumer electronics. And within each of those categories, we're tracking about 100 to 150 brands. And for each of those brands, we're capturing about 2,500 data points per brand per sort of model that we're building. And what we're doing is taking those different data points and aggregating them in different ways, analyzing them in different ways, and really showing which brands are most effective digitally and how that's changing and improving their consumers' experience. So fundamentally, what we're doing is using these models and using the data that we have to help different types of companies understand where they're behind and what they should be doing differently in order to sort of keep up with the pack or exceed the best in their categories, or to learn from other categories for that matter.
Interesting. And what are some of the use cases for this benchmark studies that companies hire someone like L2 for? If you can talk about that.
Sure. So a very, very big part of it is budget and resource allocation. Okay. So if you can think about all of the different things that a brand can do digitally, right? They could build a new website, they could start a new marketing campaign, they could enhance their social media presence, they could put a new ESP or a DMP online. There's 100 different things you can do, and it's really just helping them understand what are the priorities in their industry and where should they be focusing their resources and how should they be thinking more smartly about spending the limited number of dollars they have effectively to be able to both gain voice in their client's mind as well as sort of keep up with the Joneses in their industry.
Interesting. So I was talking to one of the digital from a digital industry space, some guy, I think last month, I guess, and he actually quoted something that caught my attention. So he said, Vishal, whatever money is to banker is what data is for the digital industry folks. So I said, okay, sure, like I'll take that.
That sounds like a thing somebody might say, sure.
Right, exactly. So I said that let's take that. So with that savvy sort of industry in data, what are some of the struggles or challenges that you face that you think?
So I think that ultimately, when you look at the type of data that we have in digital, we have it's mostly all the same pot of data, but it gets used in two functionally different ways, right? One is learning more about users, and the other is optimizing the experience. And those are really the two sort of fundamental ways we think about it. And optimizing the experience can be everything from making sure the right people see the right ads, making sure the website is designed properly, making sure that your social media posts are proper, making sure that your email output is segmented, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Making sure the content is personalized where it should be. So there's all these different ways that you can use that data to make the digital experience personalized. And it's something we read a lot about. Obviously, that's a big part of the way that Google and Facebook look at the world. And increasingly, it is the primary way in which Amazon looks at the world.
Interesting.
The other side of that is really more of the insight side of it, where like any type of business, be it a retail business or a media business or any type of marketing brand, you want to understand who your users are. You want to understand what are the types of messages that resonate with them. You want to understand what's going to change their behavior or emotions in a way that's to your benefit. And that's sort of the other side of digital data. And we've been quite effective as an industry sort of looking at both of those two different things, both together and independently. The challenge comes, and this is sort of a bit of an old saw, is that you can measure almost anything in digital, but almost none of it's important. And that is that if you look at what marketing is traditionally supposed to do, right? Marketing is supposed to change how you feel about something, right? Marketing is supposed to change emotionally how tied you are to a brand, or whether or not you think a brand is an innovator, or whether or not you are more likely to buy that brand if you're sort of in a lower down the funnel type position. There are many parts of digital where we do a very bad job measuring and optimizing to attitude, and measuring and optimizing to how marketing should really be effective. And that's one of those areas where I think there's a lot of different companies and a lot of different approaches that people have looked at in order to try to create those types of optimization schemas. But we really lack a good dependent variable in a lot of cases to actually optimize towards, because we don't have, we don't have wires into your brain. So we'll not get this, right? But we're getting closer in some ways. If you take a look at, for example, the role of unbranded search or branded search, for example. So the degree to which somebody is searching for a specific brand with specific type of branded modifiers associated with it. That gives us a good idea about how general consumer sentiment is changing towards the brand itself. There's also types of social media scraping and different types of text and analytics that we're employing on social media to really get an understanding of how people are talking about brands in those spaces. The challenge, particularly in the social media space, though, is that it tends to be a U-shaped curve, right? You tend to have either the complainers, the lovers, and what you don't get is a lot of the folks in the middle. And it turns out most of us are pretty much in the middle when it comes to brands. And so it's difficult to optimize around that. Where I think our studies have been most effective and where we've seen probably the best sort of direction in terms of understanding on a more qualitative branding level how people feel is by looking at Amazon reviews. Amazon reviews have the benefit of knowing that the user has actually bought and interacted with the product. And so while it doesn't give you the entire view, it doesn't give you some of the more traditional sort of upper funnel measures, it does tend to do a pretty good job giving you actionable insights into user thinking and behavior within the largest retailer in the world. And we're hoping to start doing similar types of analytical work, looking at other retailers and probably focusing quite a bit on Tmall in China specifically, so we get a better sense of some of those dynamics in the Chinese market.
Interesting. And I think, so one interesting segue for my previous conversation that I was talking to you about with a friend, and you touched briefly on that. So he said, Vishal, as bankers have a lot of money and they can screw up because they have too much of it, that's the same problem with a digital marketer or digital analyst, because we are dealing with data, so we are most often stuck in analysis paralysis all the time, and overdoing many things, which probably leads to no sort of yield or outcome. And you touched briefly on that. So what are some of your, say, best practices that you would see suggesting that, hey, you are getting into that hole?
Yeah, I think there's two fundamental approaches to think about, and one is sort of an exploratory approach, and one's a reporting approach. From an exploratory approach, and this is particularly at Nielsen, we made we had a very strong culture around hypothesis testing. And one of the best ways to avoid analysis paralysis is to think about the world in terms of sort of traditional scientific method and hypothesis testing. And sometimes that type of approach is glossed over because current users of data may say, well, I don't need to do that. I have so much information to look at. I don't really need to do proper hypothesis testing. And what we found is that tends to lead people down all the wrong holes. You need to sort of know the key questions you're asking and sort of how to ask an interesting question. And that's the best way to really extract that content from the data itself, from either an insights or an optimization standpoint. The other, I think, key and really, really important thing is looking properly defining KPIs in businesses. One of the things that we probably spent the most time with at Huge when we were setting up analytical engagements with our clients was proper KPI development and understanding sort of how you can create very, very, very limited numbers of KPIs to really help steer the business, and understanding what sort of your hierarchy of data is to be able to provide actual insights rather than just being sort of buried in numbers. And one of my favorite dashboards that I ever made for a client was an email that came once a day, and it was a very large percentage. It would say 3%, a giant number, very large number, had a green or red arrow next to it.
Beautiful.
And a link below it that said, "Tell me more." And that was the and then the "tell me more" would lead to I think it was a Tableau dashboard at the time. But the idea that for the most part, most of the business users that we'll work with or have traditionally worked with really want a very high level of information. And it's actually generally data practitioners who are making life more difficult. That by trying to add more and more and more what is perceived value, you're actually reducing value by creating more noise. And having a good sort of ability to edit and a good way to sort of think about how to steer your insights and your experience optimization to actual business needs is a very clear and direct way to minimize the amount of data noise that you're creating.
Interesting, interesting. And I think your conversation, so your description sort of reminds me of a conversation that I have like a couple of years ago with one of the BlackBerry product managers. And he said that, Vishal, you know what? We were hitting our numbers. Like, I'm one of the best performer in the industry. I'm sort of the goal that I've been given. I'm just killing it. But the market itself shifted underneath, right? And they don't have their plugs on those sort of those indexes, which actually became the critical part of the market as it emerged. And he said, so it's my marketing or digital team's fault. They're not able to sense this this sort of this storm of new emerging marketplace, and it just went into this pass and parcel sort of conversation. So I think, what are some of your thoughts on and I think, as Nielsen also, you must, and as a digital industry guy, every day we hear a new social network coming into play, that where customers are engaging and interacting, right? So we have this now. It's more cumbersome now than what BlackBerry faced in its early days, when it was almost losing to Apple or iPhone. So what are some of your suggestions on how people could tap onto these emerging sort of data sets and still stay relevant to their core?
Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting point. It's sort of the innovator's dilemma type issue.
Right.
I'm pretty sure BlackBerry was screwed regardless of the type of data they had, but I'm not sure there would have been a proper solution to that, and I'm not sure data could have told them anything. But it's good to think that there might have been, and I'm glad he blamed his digital team. That's great. There is the rightest form of data. Is not necessarily the newest form of data, right? There are ways that we can glean content from Snapchat, or there's ways that we can glean content from other types of social sources to be able to get more information. But that's not necessarily where sort of the best data in the world is, or the most insightful data in the world are. In those cases, specifically, with sort of particularly with newer social platforms, you may be using the data from those platforms to understand how to optimize the experience on those platforms themselves. So, how many Instagram posts should I make per day? What should the color palette look like? What types of hashtags should I use? What should the type of content in the text that I have? How does that impact how people engage with it? That content. That's all very valuable stuff to know, and it's really important, particularly when you're working on an individual platform. But I think to your larger point, one of the challenges with data that's siloed like that is it does a very poor job typically talking to other data sources. And so understanding the relationship, for example, of optimizing the experience on Instagram does you very little good frequently, knowing how to know how to optimize the experience, for example, on a e-commerce platform. They're two wholly different things, and those two data sets are probably not going to work together unless you've done something pretty awesome. But what it does tell you is, on an individual platform by platform basis, sort of how to work in it. And the way that I think you make the selection in terms of which of those types of data you want to use comes down to, for your specific type of user, which of those platforms themselves are most important. With the understanding that there are certain platforms like Facebook, Google, and Amazon primarily that are important to everybody. And that that no one gets a pass on doing analytics into those three platforms, because they have all functionally and fundamentally changed their industries so much. And particularly Amazon, even though Amazon is sort of thought of right now as a significant voice in some parts of the retail environment, the impact that they're beginning to have in fashion, the impact that they're beginning to have in certain types of CPG products, CPG categories, is so substantial and is so nascent still that having good intelligence and good data that you're extracting from those platforms and working with their internal data is one of the very few ways that you can best understand how to functionally work with Amazon. One of the jokes that we make around the office is that the difference between Amazon and any type of traditional retailer is that with a traditional retailer, you have a relationship with a brand. With Amazon, you have a relationship with an algorithm. Yes. And being able to make sure that you're feeding the algorithm the content it needs, and understanding that algorithm well enough that you're going to be able to optimize the experience. So you're winning the buy box and you're first in search and your sales are growing appropriately has to do with you really understanding their data inside and out and the way their algorithms work inside and out. And there's no real shortcut to doing that. It's not, it's not about having dinner, great wine, and playing golf. It's about really sort of getting down to the math and understanding what's impacting different parts of the Amazon experience for users.
Interesting. I think that's very well said, by the way. So one thing that I definitely am curious about when I was looking at your profile. So you represent global companies. You worked in their digital team, and I think one of the things that and digital industries are suffer from is like so you have the similar data all across. So Facebook is everywhere accessible, but the culture has a strong influence on decision making, right? So a Facebook interaction in US might not be the same as the interaction in maybe Europe or whatever. Like cultural play a very significant role in how you perceive data or how you interact with these networks and get your sort of feeds. So what are some of your insights on when you're analyzing for a global brand where sort of every locality plays a significant role, or every locality's local culture plays a significant role? And by the way, you also have a crossroad of a global company's culture that's also like you have to maintain. So what are some of the thoughts that comes to your mind when you're handling sort of those scenarios?
Yeah, I would say there's three main things. The first is having local feet on the ground is invaluable. Particularly when you're analyzing data, understanding the cultural context behind what you're analyzing is critical. And trying to run data operations from the United States or from Western Europe is just not really feasible for global operations. So you need to be able to have pods in the markets that you care most about. That's thing one. Thing two is really understanding the regulations on the ground. Particularly when you look at, and you could use the sort of three different markets of the US, EU, and China, and understanding sort of the data constraints and the data differences in each of those markets and what you can and can't realistically do is really important. And that's something that you just kind of have to hit the books and do. I think it's probably been well trod how different the EU use of cookies is from the way that you can use cookies and other types of personal data in the United States. But really understanding that and taking it to heart that there's some types of, for example, targeting mechanisms that just aren't feasible in Europe. And increasingly, the EU is locking down a lot of personal data and sort of new and exotic ways to make it more challenging to functionally use the data, use different types of data in that market. I don't necessarily have an opinion whether or not that's good or bad. I mean, I guess I do. I personally think that cookies are the least of our privacy worries, and worrying about cookies seems like a bit of an oddity to me. But that's fine. We'll let the lawyers do whatever the lawyers do. I think the third large sort of data concern that you have when you're working internationally is finding the right partner or the right source. There's a tendency, particularly of large global companies, to try to single source on a specific data partner or a specific data source. And what we've found both here at L2 and historically at Nielsen, and as well as when I worked at NBC, finding local data providers is a significantly more effective way of doing business than trying to work with Kantar globally or something along those lines, or some sort of massive global provider. Because there are so many intricacies to individual markets that are really just unexpected. You need to know somebody who can, who really knows the space in that area specifically. So, a very basic example is the data partner and that we work with in China, or one of the data partners we work with in China. One of the things they're best at is figuring out how to get us large volumes of data through the Chinese firewall. Nice. And that's something that they've had to learn and build experience over time. And that's not something that a global partner may have had the wherewithal or sort of thinking to kind of figure that out.
Interesting. I think that's a very, very interesting point. I never anticipated that, actually, that you're right, that even the data provider plays a important role to get the local sort of data. So I think one of the things, as you were describing about the global landscape, I was thinking about the Amazon example that you gave recently about you have to make a relationship with an algorithm, right? So one of the things that I in my strategy practice talk a lot about is doing so. Data science being the art, the science of doing business, and then the business strategy is the art of doing business. So if the more you use data, you actually try to invite more science of doing business into the art of doing business,
Mhm.
and that might sort of. So now the problem with algorithm inherently is they are biased, right? So they stack some things together, and they pretty much analyze, okay, this is the trend, so probably this is going to go in the future too. So how would, and it sort of circumvents again those market conditions probably, or some sort of top down discovery that might happen. So what are some of your thoughts around the idea of that if we rely more on algorithms for decision making, then we may be losing out on the art of doing business, which again is our intuitive cognitive abilities to sort of figure out and do things.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so one of the best work experiences I've ever had is my sort of research partner while I was at Huge was one of our consumer experience user experience leads, Sophie Kleber. She's fantastic.
Hmm.
And Sophie and I were great partners working together. One of the reasons why is she is fundamentally an artist, right? This is
Nice.
what she does with her time, and she thinks like an artist. She acts like an artist. She dresses like an artist. I think like a math science guy. I dress like a math science guy. I act like a math science guy. When we work together, we produce some of the best work that I've ever done.
Nice.
And the reason why is that it's very easy for me to surround myself with, and I think this is your point, with people who think similarly to me, who have the
Hmm.
same assumptions, who tend to make the decisions in the same way based on what we believe to be sort of truth and data. And there's something to be said for somebody who has an entirely different background, who can sort of look more deeply at sort of the qualitative elements associated with solving a problem, and just look at the problem in a different way. Surrounding yourself with different types of creative thinkers is, I think, extremely valuable for people in our field, and is something that is frequently not done, and I think is a mistake.
Interesting, interesting. And I think so. By the way, well said. Thank you for that. So now I want to spend some time about your current role. So you are chief data scientist and chief data officer in L2. What does that
Yep.
really mean? And what do you do? And if you can shed some light on that.
Sure, sure. So the group that I run at L2 is responsible more or less for making all of the data that's in our analysis, as well as managing all of our data models. So
Interesting.
we have sort of three hunks of people at L2 as a company, right? We have strategists who are kind of explaining to clients sort of what they should be doing with their time, and how they should be spending their money. We have researchers who are doing sort of research into specific industries and helping to understand the trends there. And we have our data technology folks, which is my group. So we're responsible for making and deploying all of the data that is used by those other two groups. We use sort of three fundamental flavors of data at L2. None of it is PII, personally identifiable data. All the data we look at is on a brand level. So the three types of data we look at fundamentally are what we consider human collected data. So we have a team of hourly workers who look at websites, and we have a data system where they can punch in all the different features and assets that website has on it. How can you sort search in different ways? What are the elements of the nav, et cetera? So we have that team that's entering data into sort of our data system. That's about a third of the total data points that we're capturing for a given study. We have what we consider continuous data from a lot of our data partners, which is about a third of our data. And this is with companies like eDataSource,
Hmm.
Unmetric, SimilarWeb, companies who we have either barter or commercial relationships with, where we're acquiring their data and processing their data in different ways to use in our analysis. And then we have our own set of proprietary scrapers, which we're using primarily to extract content from both Amazon and Google. And that's about a third of our data as well. All three of those sort of types of data are kind of brought together into one platform and are integrated on the brand level. And so any of our researchers or strategists can go in anytime and look up, all the content and all the data that we have on a specific brand, up to about 3,000 data points, that we collect around that. That whole architecture overall also replicates our digital IQ, which is sort of the core model that we use in our reporting, so clients can really understand how well they're doing. And so all of that's sort of automated through the same platform. So we build, manage that platform. We do all that type of fun stuff.
Interesting. And how much of your role is in facing vis-a-vis out facing, client facing versus like internally making sure the your benchmarking is rolling out? If you can.
It's funny. I've spent most of my career externally facing. That has primarily been my job, and certainly was a large part of my job, both at Nielsen and at Huge. My role here, though, is significantly more internally facing. And that's partially because at this point, our data ecosystem is so complex that it really requires all of somebody's attention, as well as the team overall, to make sure things continue to work properly. My hope when I had started this job would be that, within 2 years, and it's now been about a year and a half, we'd be sort of in turn the crank mode. We are not in turn the crank mode. We are constantly trying to fix and tweak things and improve the models that we have, and I don't imagine that changing. As you had said before, the space overall changes so frequently, and the types of data that we're working with change so frequently that every month or 2 months we may be looking at a new data source that we want to onboard and bring into our architecture and bring into our overall analytical platform and models. And all of that takes time and energy and a significant amount of thoughtfulness. I've also found that that people who are 25 have significantly more time and energy and enjoyment out of talking to clients than I do at this point. So I'll leave it to them as well too.
Interesting. So I think again you raise a very good point about emerging data sources, and there are a lot of it's coming every new day. We have new sources coming, or new source of data coming. How do you recruit these channels or sources? Like, what are some of the ways to qualify, say, a source? You say, okay, maybe Instagram. So now let's start monitoring Instagram as like what's the process? If you can walk us through that, will be really amazing.
Sure. So the first sort of step in the process is the basic question: is there a platform that we either do not have enough information coverage on, but we have some data on, or similarly, is there a new platform out there that we have no information coverage on? And if the answer to either of those things is true, then we need to figure out how to solve the problem. So the next question is, should we acquire the data? Should we make the data on our own, which we can do in a lot of cases, or should we model the data based on other data sources that we have presently? That sort of build versus buy decision is sort of that next phase. And when we are in the build versus kind of build sort of part of that decision tree, what we tend to look for is what's the feasibility of us actually building it and doing a good job at it. And two, is this data set that we're looking for something that's more or less a commodity now? So an example of that would be initially when I started working here, we scraped all of our own Facebook and Twitter data, right? We had scrapers that were doing that work. Relatively shortly thereafter, we actually shut down that scraper part of our business and we onboarded a partner. The reason we onboarded a partner is because they could do it faster, cheaper, all that other stuff. And it's not, having scrapers is not a core part of our business. It just happened to be the way that we were getting the data. So in that case, we onboarded a partner. As we're going through that process, the next sort of phase after that is, if we're thinking about do we want to onboard a partner, what we'll typically look at is a number of different players in the market, what their cost structure is, what their availability is, and all of that type of fun stuff. And then we're typically balancing out the combination of functionality, quality, and price in terms of how we assess those different types of data sources. Functionality is obviously really important. Embedded in functionality to some degree is quality as well. Quality is something that we have a variety of different ways that we judge, and we have a pretty rigorous scoring rubric that we put together in terms of how we measure the quality of a data source. Everything from its outage time to how well it connects to manual data, to how much of the data they have to model and what's the error rates associated with the models that they have in place. And then price is price. It has to be part of the factor, where part of the way that we factor in the data, and that part of the business. We are not a large company. We have about 300 clients. We have about 200 employees. And so we're not going to go out and spend, $500,000 on a data source. We need to sort of figure out a way to get it in a cost-effective way that's not going to hurt sort of our bottom line or our top line.
Interesting. I think so. Great for sharing that. So let's talk about something on the modeling end. So okay, so now you recruited a data source. You said okay, and you found a partner, and now it's feeding in. So So how do you recruit a new data source from the algorithm's point of view? Like, do you have something like an ontology that you just create and say, okay, I know how to talk to, and I have like a bunch of. So what are some of the thoughts? Like, how do you integrate a new source into your existing algorithm?
I see. Yeah. So what we do generally is we have a pretty defined structure that we know will work within our overall architecture. So what we'll typically do is more or less build an ETL layer in between the data partner and ourselves. So we'll onboard the data partner's sort of raw data through an API or something along those lines, however they choose to get it to us. And then using a relatively standardized ETLing system that we built in-house, we can then transform that data into a way in which it will work with the rest of our data set. So the way our data is fundamentally architected is that we use a concept called a resource as sort of the unit of measurement. And in this case, what a resource is any definable asset that a brand has that's trackable and uniquely identifiable. So the example of that would be the URL of a website, the sender address from an email account, or a social handle, right? Those are unique variables. And so what we'll do then is basically make that key to that variable and transform the data so it matches underneath that, and then it can be architected into the overall system. Our data system overall has a relatively loose structure inside of it. The users themselves, the analysts or the researchers, create the concept of a brand by aggregating those resources together. So they will then say, this URL that we're tracking, this social handle, they belong to the concept of the brand in the way that I want to measure it right now for the piece of the research that I'm doing. Initially, we had tried to build something that was a much harder taxonomy and a much more highly defined taxonomy. And what we found was that because of the diversity in terms of the way that we look at categories, that wasn't going to work. You take a brand, for example, like Estee Lauder. Estee Lauder may have 30 different email accounts, 50 different websites, 20 different social handles, etc. And if, for example, we only wanted to look at the hair care section, in most cases, the researcher who is following hair care will know the proper resources to aggregate together. And so we generally use that sort of user-defined taxonomy as the way that we sort of structure our internal architecture. So when we're processing data, it's really making sure that it fits those standards.
Interesting. I think that's well said. So there was a guy from Boston, David Rose. So he's working on a company called Ditto. I think he said the same thing, that the classifier pretty much many times the classifier dictates, the clients dictate the classifiers. So if clients, they come with the use case, they say, okay, I want to monitor, say, just a beer and wherein people are enjoying their beer or something. So we'll start from there, and then sort of we just, instead of going and creating a fire hose and sort of having a lot of use cases up front, we'll let the client and recruit those things. So I think, thank you so much for sharing that, by the way. So now,
sorry, just to push on that point a little bit more. I do think that one of the challenges that we have with this approach, and something that is probably worth knowing when others go down this path, is you do at a certain point run into the problem that you have, for example, when you have a content management system that has an unending list of tags associated with it. If you let users define every taxonomy, you end up with just a nightmare of a governance problem. And so we do try to walk that line. And part of that is that when we are building our classifiers, we do build a relatively defined classifier set that's associated with those resources. So there's only so many things you can assign to a specific resource, and the user can pull from those. So it's not they don't have an unlimited ability to do anything, because that just leads to chaos. And particularly if we want to try to control the consistency of our research overall that we're presenting to our clients. Making sure there is some controlled vocabulary that we're using is really important, and that we're managing the methodology properly.
Interesting, interesting. And now let's talk about your leadership style, if at all. So, if suppose you say you take a new job, right? So and you expect, say, a data science team to do something. So, what are some of the expectations that you just come pre-biased with? Say, I expect this data science to be like this. So, what would that be? If you can share, that will be helpful.
Yeah, I don't know if this is a leadership style thing, but it's definitely the way that I think about employees when I tend to hire. I tend to bucket data scientists into one of three types. And you can potentially, I've worked with people, and there are people on my team that fill multiple ones of these buckets. But to me, there's sort of three primary elements that I look for. One is sort of just straight up data engineering, data management, data architecture skills. And I found that typically, and also coding skills associated with that. So being a top shelf Python developer or something along those lines. I found that those people who are particularly good in that area that I've been able to hire at the rate that I want to be able to hire people at tend to be different than the other two types, distinctly different. And that's okay. I don't necessarily need a unicorn. I don't necessarily need somebody who can do all three of the things. The second thing is the ability to actually extract unstructured data and process unstructured data in smart ways, and not necessarily do the analysis on the data itself, but understand really fundamentally how to work with unstructured data and be able to build that into either build the models or build the processes or the extractions that will allow other people to use it properly. And the last are people who are much more analytically driven or analytically bent, and those are folks that may have a more traditional statistical background, have much more of a traditional data modeling background, segmentation background, et cetera. What I've generally found is that for all three of those types of people, just because as data scientists continue to grow as a field, each of those things have gotten a little bit easier. And so you see a more of a blending of all three of those skill sets. But those are the three areas that I try to focus on. My predilection, just because of my background, is to the third, and so I try to make sure, particularly on the first two, that I hire and have strong leaders in those areas, places where I can really rely on people. The current head of my data engineering team is Raj, is awesome, and nobody can have him. He's the best. So we just want to make sure that we have really great, strong people in those places. So honestly, if we have to figure out how to restructure our AWS relationships or how we want to restructure the databases and how much needs to be on Redshift versus Postgres, there's somebody who I can trust to make those decisions, and it's not going to blow up on me.
Interesting. And I think from my conversation with a bunch of leaders so far, I think I found there are two primary trains of thoughts. So one is someone who says, okay, I believe in more of a council-like structure. So I'll go in and I'll start creating councils with different business groups and say, okay, get me one of those guys, sort of whatever, right? And the other is, okay, I'll pretty much start working on a very tiny use case. I'll recruit my magic one or two or threes and start working my way up, and then sort of keep expanding and delivering and kind of creating, maybe both of the ways we are getting center of excellence in a way. But so which option would you side with, and why? If that will be helpful.
Yeah, and I think this probably comes from my background being more client-facing, is that I feel like the most effective way is to win the small battles and build up to the bigger ones. So to find a specific use case that you think you can kill, do a great job on, win there, and that just continues to build sort of your internal support, build additional resources, build new ways of you looking at the world, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And once you've sort of done that, you've typically proven to either your boss or your boss's boss or the CFO or whomever that you can be effective, and so more things start coming to you. And there's a certain point that I've reached in most of my roles where you begin to notice that the demand is outstripping your capacity, and that's sort of when that's when things are good, right?
Yeah,
I mean, it's
right.
kind of painful at the moment, but It's when you can go back to the CFO and say, look, we're actually getting some great success here. We've had, we're hitting our KPIs. We have very happy internal clients. Let's look at trying to expand the program into these new different types of use cases. If you try to be all things to all people, what you tend to end up doing is building, a giant data lake or something like that that doesn't have a specific use case, and you don't end up getting the value you want to out of it. And I think then you end up getting people who are pretty mad at you.
Interesting. So let's talk about your magic hire, right? So if suppose you join a company and you would to hire just one guy to help you with or whatever. So what are some of the traits that you think this candidate? And I think you shared a tad bit of it in your previous responses. But what would that, if you can sort of quantify and qualify that candidate? I think that will be helpful.
Yeah, I think at this point in my career, my magic hire is probably a very, very, very strong data engineer who, one, has interest in the business that we're working in, and that's sometimes hard to find, actually. You can find great data engineers who don't particularly care about the specific business. If they don't care about the business, they're not going to be effective. So finding a very strong data engineer who cares about the business and also is analytically minded. They don't need to necessarily have analytical skills. That isn't necessarily a requirement, but they understand analytical use cases, and they understand why you would want things built in a specific way. And that's, building a data engineer who's looking at the world the way I have to look at the world from a sort of a research and analytics standpoint versus a data engineer who's going to, for example, be sitting behind a consumer-facing application are two totally different ways of looking at the world, and making sure the person has sort of that proper sort of view. I think it's really important. The sort of second magic hire that I typically make is somebody who who's typically right out of school, has a social science background, and some good, strong data skills, who's highly intellectually curious and willing to work really, really hard in order to really get great analyses out of the data that we have. And what I found is that I typically need that person to just kind of be the Robin to my Batman, because you can't do everything on your own, and having somebody who you can delegate to, having somebody you can bounce ideas off of, and somebody who wear the red costume is always good.
Interesting. I think that's well said. So let's talk about a dissimilar industry. So say maybe manufacturing or maybe industrial internet or whatever. What are some of the best practices, or like 2-3 sort of best practices that you could suggest to someone leading their data science team in a very, I don't call it a hostile environment, but very close to that, where sort of the idea of data driven is still very far. Yeah. And sort of proving anything, and then from that they have to now build this culture up and then explain people of what the hell is going on. What are some other things you could suggest to those guys? Yeah, and so there's one area I think is interesting here, and it's an area that I have sort of specific interest in. Over the past year or two, I've become really, really, really interested in HR analytics. I think it's sort of a really interesting growth space. There's a lot of opportunities for different types of analytical applications in HR. It's also very underleveraged. There isn't a lot of work there. There are some software packages. They're not great. There are some people who are experts. They tend not to be great either. And not as necessarily as an industry, but as sort of a horizontal practice within most businesses, it tends to be sort of the bastion of humanity. And I guess it's the nature of what they do for a living, right? That they have to be the nice guy. They have to be the person who can kind of think through things like that. And it's one of the things that I would recommend to folks that really want to try to implement, say, HR analytical systems. It's another one of those scenarios think about what the dependent variable should be. In HR, it's a particularly difficult problem, because we have ideas about employee retention that are important. We have ideas about employee satisfaction that are important. We have salary management that are important. All of these different types of things. So really understanding how do you optimize to those things. And some of the interesting sort of applications that I've seen out there right now are a couple of different companies that are doing very, very, very high velocity
qualitative surveys, like one question qualitative surveys that are either being pushed through Slack or being pushed through an email channel at the company, allow you to create sort of a 360 view of an employee. And then as that 360 view of the employee changes over time, you can take a look at what the exogenous factors are that are actually changing that and understand how to change those things independently. And that's a place where that approach seems particularly good for HR. One, because it tends to be relatively humanistic and human-centered, which is what that area is overall. And two, it tends to use a lot of the data they may already have around through PeopleSoft or SAP or whatever other system they're using. And I think that's a case where you take sort of the weakness the specific industry may have, this idea that it needs to be human-centric and somewhat qualitative and soft to a certain degree, and use it as a real advantage in terms of the way that you can advance an analytical practice facing in that area. I know Amazon's done some fair work internally on this. Google's done some pretty famous work internally with their people management systems using a very data-driven approach. And I think both of their approaches have some weaknesses. And so I'm interested to see sort of what comes next in that field. I think there's going to be, I think that's the next big one.
Interesting. I think so you raised an interesting point. Survey. So I used to own a company on customer experience. So I think survey was pretty much my day in and day out job a couple of years back. So I always used to sort of wonder when would we get to a stage when it's a serverless times. What are some of your thoughts on? Because now we have data from, like, we have social interactions, we have data, we have sort of these transactional sort of interactions, and we have this relational sort of. So what do you think? Like, how far are we, or from when we don't have to do survey anymore?
Yeah, I'm not sure we should ever necessarily abandon surveys as an approach. They're, as I've explained to folks on my team, surveys inherently aren't bad. Cheap surveys are, though. And the part of the problem is the market research industry overall has kind of settled that they're willing to give up quality for cost. And so because of that, you tend to have pretty shoddy surveys that come out of much of the market research industry right now. I think the survey approach, particularly for something like HR, like what we're talking about, or even user experiences, is incredibly important because there's no way to know those things otherwise. I do think there are other approaches that are sort of gaining speed. Being able to, for example, extract data from Slack for internal users, I think is interesting, as long as you're not going to creep your internal users out too much. Being able to do more user tracking on the site, looking at different types of click paths, etc., looking at different types of qualitative responses. Part of that is really interesting. But I'm not sure we'll ever necessarily be able to abandon it, nor should we want to. I do think that we, as if one is a practitioner of survey research, or if one uses surveys as part of their job, understanding what you're giving up through cheap instruments is super important, and I'm afraid that's not done nearly enough.
Interesting. Good point, by the way. So let's talk about. I think we are almost hitting to our mark, and thank you so much for sort of lending us your thoughts here. So one thing I definitely want to understand from you is the future of data in digital industries. Like, what do you think, or future of data analytics like, where do you see the capabilities heading to, or like what would you imagine happening maybe 1 year, 2 year, or 5 year down the line that you're seeing?
Yeah, I think the primary push, and I'm sure I'm not the only one who's saying this, is the continued democratization and ease of democratization of data as being sort of a core element. Low cost, relatively flexible BI platforms that run off of well-structured, well-documented, known data platforms are becoming cheaper and more abundant, particularly if you're using well-known data sources. If you're using Google Analytics, if you're using Salesforce, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, most of the existing BI platforms out there can deal with that data quite easily. And because of that, I think we're going to continue to see a push down and a push out of analytics and BI and data in general to sort of the farthest reaches of the business, and a decentralization of an analytics practice per se inside of a business. I don't think this diminishes the need for having a CDO, obviously, because if we did, I'd be talking myself out of a job. But what I do think is that the role becomes some degree less of an analytical job and becomes much more of a governance job. And that's sort of the other second trend. And again, I guess what's sort of old is new again, is that just if we're continuing to democratize data the way that we say we want to, and we have these cheaper platforms that are distributing the content for us, we do need to have a very, very, very strong governance layer. And that's something that probably outside of banking and some parts of retail still don't really exist, and maybe healthcare too.
Interesting. So, well said. And again, thank you so much, John. I think it was a treat talking to you, and I think you gave us a very great perspective on your industry, and sort of thank you so much for being very candid and sharing with our community some of those best practices that probably the future leader could sort of use and take to make their job more glorious, like yours. And
can I just put glorious on my business card now? That would be
I know this is like cheap CGO, like whatever. So yes, I think I want to do that. So by the way, so yes, thank you so much. And hope to have you back sometime later discussing how the journey is taking you and sort of sharing with us your story. That will be fascinating.
Sounds great.
I thought I was sick of home, but actually I was homesick. Never really knew that I would have to grow up so quick. I'm so uncomfortable, don't know anybody here. Just a couple dudes that I met once, that's it. And I go into the booth feeling nervous. Got butterflies in my stomach like I'm so worthless. Is the mic on? I don't know how to work this. Inside I'm breaking down, I hope I'm not up on a